Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Natalie Bell. I'm Chief Curator here at the List Visual Arts Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's program with Goldin+Senneby, ahead of our opening reception for their show and the solo exhibitions by American artist and Every Ocean Hughes. I'm going to ask you to please silence your cell phones. This is also a note to myself. And before I introduce the program, I'd like to take a moment to thank the List Center's leading exhibition supporters, Audrey and Jim Foster, and Cindy and John Reed, for their generous and longstanding belief in what we do here. Tonight, we also remember with gratitude two beloved friends of the List Center, Graham Gund and Aggie Gund. Graham and his wife, Anne, have been visionary advocates for the arts across our region and nationally. And Aggie's lifelong dedication to artists and creative communities continues to inspire us all. We also wouldn't be here without the generous support of the Institute. Among the many people at MIT to thank, I would like to recognize the Council for the Arts, Paula Hammond, our Executive Vice Provost, Dean Hashem Sarkis at the School of Architecture and Planning, and our former colleagues, Philip Corey and Leila Kinney. The List Center is a proud grantee of the Mass Cultural Council, and our programs are made possible through the generous support of many individual donors, including our wonderful group of advisory board members, and even many of you in this room. So thank you. I also want to express my appreciation for the team of colleagues here at the List Center who helped realize our 3 exhibitions, as well as this program tonight, with a special thanks to Zach Nguyen, curatorial assistant. I also want to thank Richard Julin and the team at Accelerator at Stockholm University, who organized Flare Up and invited us to bring it to MIT. The Tiger Foundation provided major support for its realization at the List Center, and we're immensely grateful for their generosity, as well as for project support from the Barbara Osher Pro Suecia Foundation and the Swedish Arts Grants Committee. Tonight's lecture is part of a series of Goldin+Senneby's recent artworks, essays, and collaborative publications that considers the language of autoimmunity, namely the fraught notion of a body at war with itself and the stakes of re-engineering life. And I know you all thought that I was done with thanks, but I do want to acknowledge the magazine Triple Canopy, which has commissioned and supported a number of these related essays and publications. The title of this presentation is Swallow Image, which is a somewhat blunt translation of the German word Schluckbildchen, swallow pictures or swallow images. Schluckbildchen existed in the 16th and 18th centuries in Bavaria and Austria. They were stamp-sized devotional portraits that were ingested by pilgrims who would get them as souvenirs at holy sites. They swallowed these tiny pictures because they believed in their miraculous healing power, which came not through prayer, but by swallowing them. I'll turn it over to the artist to invite us to think about how contemporary forms of healing remain entwined with acts of faith, ingestion, and a certain transactional relationship with images.
Today we are going to talk about the inside of my brain.
That's right, the inside of your brain. Don't we all sometimes wish we could see into someone else's head?
Or gain a peek inside the mind of an artist.
I'm Simon Goldin, by the way, and this is Goldin+Senneby. And we've been working together for 20 years, picking each other's brains on a daily basis.
But to be more precise, today we're going to talk about medical images from inside my brain and some white spots that showed up on those images 25 years ago.
We will speak about the incredible magnetism of these spots, how they've mesmerized doctors and researchers over the decades, and come to serve the shareholders of pharmaceutical companies. It will take us about half an hour, so please bear with us.
We will try to explain the making and function of the images on my spots, as well as the incredible value they have attracted. But we will not show the images themselves during the presentation. For that, we have produced a digital artwork, which is being presented online.
To actually gain that peek inside Jakob's head, it's offered at a cost in the range of $7,000 to $10,000.
A price pegged to the monthly cost of certain medications I've been on. But we'll get to that later.
Now, you see, Jakob's brain, like most brains actually, is mostly made up of water. 75, 80% water. For our demonstration here this eve, we've left out the remaining fat and protein. But we've added some contrast agent for visual effect.
We have written a long essay about the spots that showed up on my brain. It is called Regions of Interest and was published in the online magazine Triple Canopy about a year ago. Feel free to have a read at your own convenience. But in this talk, I think we should start with magnetism. Part 1, Animal Magnetism.
In 1775, the German physician Franz Mesmer discovered animal magnetism. His theory of an invisible magnetic fluid that ran through our nervous system and was subject to the ebb and flow of planetary influence, much like the tides of the ocean. He developed a healing practice with the aim of freeing this flow of magnetic liquid and creating resonance with a cosmic order.
In January 2000, I found myself inside a magnetic resonance imaging apparatus, also known as an MRI.
Mesmer developed an apparatus that he called the baquet, a state-of-the-art invention at the time, a large tub or bucket filled with magnetic liquid to which patients would attach themselves with chains, thereby connecting their animal magnetism with each other, forming a joint circuit of magnetic flow between them.
A nurse fixed my head in place with a tight cage-like contraption that looked to me like a high-tech version of Hannibal Lecter's mask. Then she handed me a panic button. I was alone, as I was slid into the tight tunnel and overwhelmed by the bombardment of sounds.
The baquet treatment was given as part of a seance, channeling the extraordinary magnetism of Mesmer himself, always dressed in a lilac robe, in a room filled with heavy incense and the haunting sounds from a glass harmonica. An instrument developed from the age-old Persian practice of musical glasses, basically rubbing a wet finger around the rim of a wine glass.
Inside the scanner, I heard noises coming from all directions. Chirping, buzzing, creaking. And then, after a moment of calm, the scanner unleashed a series of loud bangs, like a hammer hitting the wall. I was convinced someone was trying to break into the machine. Only much later have I learned that it was the noise of a giant magnet realigning the nuclear spin of water molecules inside my brain.
The patients chained to the baquet experienced dramatic convulsions, screaming, laughing hysterically, vomiting, effects that were considered curative and cathartic. When a patient's seizures became so exaggerated as to be dangerous or disruptive, Mesmer's valet, Antoine, would carry him or her to a mattress-lined crisis room where the screams would be muffled.
The claustrophobia I developed inside the scanner was not so much from the tight enclosure or the bombardment of noises, as the deeper fear of being looked inside of.
That Hannibal Lecter mask of yours is actually an antenna which sends out pulses of radio frequencies to intercept the magnetic spin inside your head. And out comes an image, providing a frequency map of where there is fat and where there is water inside your brain.
The ethereal sound of the glass harmonica has a disorienting quality because of its pitch. The frequency interval is such that the brain is not quite sure where the sound is coming from.
After a controversial case with a blind pianist in Vienna, Mesmer left in haste and established his practice in Paris. His methods immediately became the rage of the Parisian aristocracy, who lined up to join his seances. His baquet expanded in size, allowing for more and more participants to chain themselves to the magnetic circuit. And the larger the group, the more intense was the mesmerizing effect. Mesmer developed a special relationship to Marie Antoinette, who became a devout follower of his healing practice.
The price for his treatment also increased rapidly. For those who could not afford to participate in the seances themselves, Mesmer had magnetized a tree near his residence, bound with iron chains that anyone could use for a free treatment.
The cult that developed around Mesmer and his seances also became the beginning of his downfall. In 1784, the French king Louis XVI, also known as the Last King, set up a royal commission to debunk Mesmer's magnetic claims. It's unclear to what extent the king felt threatened by Mesmer inducing a social movement. To some, the free flow of mesmeric fluid became a metaphor for cleansing the body politic from all barriers to freedom. Remember, this is only a few years prior to the French Revolution.
But others have emphasized the intimate relationship between Mesmer and Marie Antoinette as the source of the king's misgivings.
Either way, the commission that set out to study Mesmer's magnetism represents a watershed in the history of scientific medicine because they introduced an explicit distinction between real and imaginary treatments. They took imagination out of medicine, you could say. While the seances clearly had strong effects on their subjects, too many things were going on all at once for the commission to feel comfortable assessing the situation as a whole. Instead, they introduced an approach based on a mathematical model where each function should be looked at separately and linked logically to one another. Only that which could be objectively measured was considered valid. They invented the first version of the blind test, which quite literally meant blindfolding the subject while testing the magnetic effect. without them knowing if or where they were being treated. The Commission concluded that outside the context of the seances, the mesmeric magnets had no independent curative effect. 0.
It has been said that the Royal Commission on Animal Magnetism was a birth scene of modern medicine, insofar as it claims to be a rational practice. Their blind test prefigures the current standard of double-blind clinical trials, where neither patient nor doctor knows if there is receiving active substance or placebo.
The report scandalized Mesmer, who had to flee also from Paris. Marie Antoinette tried to prevent him from leaving by offering him a monthly stipend of 20,000 francs. But Mesmer rejected, suggesting that a sum closer to 400,000 francs would be needed.
Part 2. Magnetic spots.
Also in Paris, but almost 100 years later, a woman in her late 20s by the name Marie-Elisabeth Luc took up a position as the personal servant of Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot, widely considered the father of modern neurology. One afternoon, Madame Luc was running an errand for Charcot. On her way from Montmartre to Bastille, she was struck by a sudden tremor. Charcot writes in his observation that it looked like she was drunk.
I too went to Paris in my late 20s in a desperate attempt to rescue my love life. My partner at the time had just moved there, and our relationship was under stress. So I bought a ticket, hoping we could sort things out face to face. Our meeting was tense, and as we walked along the Seine, I was struck by a sudden numbness in my left leg. I had no idea what it could be, and I started dragging my leg behind, hoping my partner would not notice my limp.
Luc's tremors progressed, and Charcot observed them with great interest, even though it meant her abilities as a servant suffered increasingly. Eventually, when she could no longer fulfill her household duties, he transferred her to his clinic at the Salpêtrière Hospital and continued studying and measuring her symptoms, which did not line up with any previously known diagnosis.
After my leg, my solar plexus went numb, which triggered a sense of vertigo and induced anxiety. I was convinced the symptoms were caused by the stress of my crumbling relationship. Upon returning to Stockholm, I went to my doctor, who took a few tests before suggesting I see a therapist.
It was only upon her death that Charcot had the chance to cut up Luc's head and look inside her brain, identifying scars on her central nervous system, from which she formulated the diagnosis multiple sclerosis, multiple scars. A diagnosis which from the outset was visually represented by these spots on the brain.
Only after my second episode of sudden unexplained numbness was I sent not to a psychiatrist but into an MRI scanner. The white spots that came out on my MRI scan indicated inflammation around the scars, once identified on Luc's brain. I could tell how excited my neurologist was about gaining this view straight into my head. An image of my diagnosis, multiple sclerosis, while I was still alive. You know the saying, seeing is believing. I remember my doctor saying with satisfaction, seeing and quantifying is believing.
A small note of clarification here, which is of some importance for a further reading of the image. Whereas Charcot saw actual scars on Luc's dead brain when cutting it up, what Jacob's doctor was seeing and believing were not the actual scars, but pockets of inflammation. Remember the nuclear spin of water surrounding these scars. With that distinction in mind, we now move to the third and final part, spot price.
This was a brief historical background to how the spots on my brain have been pictured, and how these images have become a central feature in of my diagnosis. It sets the scene for a dispute that erupted around a fireplace in a cabin by Lake Huron in Ontario, Canada, in the fall of 1992.
4 of the leading neurologists in North America at the time had met up in the cabin to examine the data from a clinical trial of a drug called interferon beta 1b, later to be marketed as betaseron. And their argument was about how to interpret the images of the white spots.
The drug, which had been developed by a biotech subsidiary of Shell Oil, was initially thought to offer a cure for cancer. But the trial results were disappointing. It was then tested on HIV/AIDS, but again to no avail. Then someone at the company said, why don't we try them on MS? There wasn't a great deal of belief in this, but the company sat on the drug and had funding to do a trial. So that's how it happened.
The trial, of course, was double-blind, so the investigators saw the data from the patients for the very first time when meeting in that cabin by Lake Huron. And they were excited. 125 years after Charcot had formulated the diagnosis, they saw for the very first time a treatment that seemed to be doing something.
After 2 years on the trial, the number of relapses had dropped with about 30% among those receiving the drug, compared to those on placebo. That meant 30% fewer episodes like the sudden numbness I experienced in Paris after arguing with my partner. Although this seemed promising, the doctors all knew that this was not enough to get the drug approved. Because you see, while relapses are uncomfortable, scary, and to some really serious, for most of us with MS, they are not our main concern. For the simple reason that they pass, you relapse and you recover.
But then there were the images, the MRI scans of the patient's brains collecting during the trial period. The scans displayed truly remarkable results. Not only did the accumulation of spots slow down among those on treatment, it actually reversed. After 2 years, the treated patients had fewer and smaller spots on their MRIs, whereas the spots continued to accumulate and grow on the scans of the placebo patients. So what exactly did this mean? This was the big image dispute in the cabin 30 years ago.
Dr. Donald Patey, who had led the trial in Vancouver, was the biggest believer in the magnetic images. He was truly mesmerized. While the trial proceeded, while the trial protocol only required annual MRIs, Dr. Patey had scanned his patients every 6 weeks and was convinced that shrinking the white spots would not only cut down the relapses, but reverse the course of the disease. He boldly proclaimed that the image is the disease, and he had identified the cure. He even thought he would win the Nobel Prize for it.
But the cabin in which the meeting took place belonged to another doctor, Dr. George Ebers, who was far more skeptical in his interpretation of the scans. Were those spots of inflammation really the cause of the scarring of the nervous system, or merely a symptom of that scarring? Even if limiting the inflammation could reduce relapses in the short term, he was not convinced it would affect the progression of irreversible disability over the longer term, no matter how fancy the images looked.
But in the decisive meeting, the US Food and Drug Administration were persuaded by the visual impact of the scans. They accepted the image as the disease and approved the drug to treat it.
What followed was a pharmaceutical frenzy more intense than that of mesmerism. Within a year of its approval, betaseron became the most successful drug ever of the German pharmaceutical giant Schering that had acquired the drug before it hit the market. Although the FDA approval officially mandated follow-up studies to secure that the effects suggested by the images would actually manifest in the lived experience of patients, few seemed interested in this once the drugs were selling and selling and selling.
And Donald Patey's scanners went hot. While he had been paid $700,000 for performing the scans in the betaseron trial, a year later, a competing pharmaceutical offered him 10 times that amount to document the white spots on the brain on their trial participants. The MRI had become the gold standard. The pharmaceutical companies happily poured money into these images because they validated new drugs and unlocked a quickly expanding market.
But there was also Ebers. He was an undisputable authority in MS research, becoming head of neurology at Oxford University, and he set himself up as the great iconoclast, a one-man commission who spent 15 years trying to persuade the FDA, the drug company, and his colleagues to actually investigate if the image was the disease.
And believe it or not, Ebers won the uphill battle. After 15 years, he convinced Schering to do a follow-up study on all the surviving patients from the original betaseron trial. He found that the MRI scans had no independent predictive value on the progression of disability, 0. The image was, in fact, not the disease.
But by this point, Ebers was old, and so was betaseron. A whole new generation of drugs had entered the market, and they were said to be much more effective. Only their effect was still being evaluated with the same magnetic images.
As the years have passed, each new treatment I've been prescribed has been accompanied by new scans. And my initial fear of being looked inside of has shifted toward a fear of not being seen. Increasingly, my feeling was that all the doctors could find were the spots they had set out to see, the image of their own diagnosis.
Epilogue. Eat your image before the image eats you. Sorry, but we're not quite done. So while you digest the final scene of this story, we thought we'd offer you a small swallow image, our version of a Schluckbildchen, as Natalie mentioned in her introduction. So we have some assistants here, Emily and Zach and a few others. We'll be starting to distribute our Schluckbildchens to you. So please see as they're passed around and take one. We give you a minute or two just to... Just get that now.
Gärna bild. This scene took place in my bathtub last weekend. For the first time in several years, I allowed myself to take a hot bath. Inspired by Mesmer's seances, I'd even added some ambient music and a touch of incense. I imagined my tub being an oversized bouquet as I slid down into the hot water.
While Jakob was lying in his bathtub, I was in our studio trying to finish the script for our presentation today.
You see, I need a script for knowing what to say. As my MS have progressed, I no longer have the capacity, the cognitive capacity to speak freely in a coherent way. And Simon needs the script to know when to stop. Without it, he can go on and on.
I was going over the data one more time. The MS drug market had surpassed $20 million per year, still without offering any real improvement to the long-term progression of the disease. And the price of individual MS drugs had gone up more than almost any tradable commodity over the last 3 decades. Remarkably, even the price of the earliest drugs continued to rise year by year, despite patents expiring and new treatments appearing. Betaseron has gotten 10 times as expensive since 1993.
The first minute in the bath was bliss. A bodily memory of something I used to really enjoy. But soon enough, the drowsiness came over me. I started to lose touch with my lower body. I don't know how I could have mesmerized myself into this ridiculous idea. I can't really do heat anymore. Heat immediately worsens my symptoms. It slows the conduction between my already scarred nerves.
I was thinking about the term spot price, which in finance means the price of an asset with immediate delivery, as opposed to futures price where the asset would be delivered in the future. While MS drugs clearly haven't delivered the future that patients hope for, their spot price has continued to rise year by year, delivering remarkable returns to investors.
I quickly let out the water from the tub, but it was too late. I couldn't move. My limbs were completely unresponsive. I was stranded, alone in my empty tub, shivering. I thought to myself, if this had been a real bouquet, at least I would have had company. I tried to imagine Mesmer's valet, Antoine, gently picking me up and carrying me to the bed.
Unaware of the desperate bathtub situation you were in, I wrote an SMS to you. The spots in your head are not the disease, it's the spot price, which is the true sickness. And I added, could that be an ending to our talk?
I heard the ping on my phone, but it was out of reach. In desperation, I cried out, "Hey Siri, please call Simon." No response. And again, louder, "You can call Simon." upon which series started playing You Can Call Me Al by Paul Simon. If you have your chocolate, Schluckbildchens, now you can decide for yourselves whether you want to follow the link or swallow blindly. Thank you very much.